Almost like she knew she was being
Video. She's like, I want to be on video. All right, let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila. Didn't like that. Almost like she knew she was being
Video. She's like, I want to be on video. All right, let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila. Didn't like that. Almost like she knew she was being
Video. She's like, I want to be on video. All right, let's go on the ocean.
Huh?
No, let's go on the sand.
All right, come on, Lila.
Welcome to the show. I'm Brett, your host, and the one who'll be talking for the next hour, taking your questions, talking about Docker, DevOps, all the container things on the internet, the cloud, that kind of stuff. And if you're new to this channel, this is basically something I do every week. And I get on the internet and I take questions from the chat, and we have a little bit of a conversation about things you're working on, students in my Docker courses, which you can get on my website. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There's actually a little, I think, URL right here you can check out. And I've got some big announcements today. So there's some stuff coming that Skunkworks that I haven't talked about to anyone. So This is something that I'm excited to talk about, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But just a quick recap. This is my channel on YouTube where I talk about Docker and DevOps stuff. The way that you make sure that you get notified that this show happens, because it usually happens on Thursdays, but sometimes we do bonus shows or I do them on different days depending on when I'm available, is to click subscribe, and that little dinner bell right next to the subscribe will alert you when I go live, so you won't miss a live show. Now, the live show is how you get your questions answered, but you can always watch these shows later after they get processed by YouTube, so they'll be around. And something that I'm going to talk about today for a couple of minutes is that the sort of bonus round of this show is the segments that are useful to you, or common questions that I get, or maybe something that we all discover together while we're talking here. Those are going to be turning into clips and are going to go onto a new podcast. So I'm launching a podcast this week. It'll be available the next couple of days on iTunes and all the places that you can get podcasts. But this is actually your idea. This is based on ideas and requests from students and people that jump on this Q&A every week and asked, hey, is there a way that I can listen to this on the go without having to download YouTube videos? And we thought about it for a while. My team helped me come up with a good idea. We're calling it DevOps and Docker Talk. And all these ideas are not mine, basically. And we're turning it into a podcast. So every week, if there's any good segments or clips that come out of this show, they're actually going to be turned into other content. And some of it will be loaded up on to my courses. So if you're a student in my Docker Mastery or in my Swarm Mastery courses, you'll notice today new videos in a new section at the end that you essentially get to watch the best parts of this show as a part of the courses without YouTube ads or without having to download another podcast. They'll all be there, and they'll be in the sections, or they'll be in the courses rather, related to them. So the Swarm topics that we talk about here that I think are useful will go into the Swarm Mastery course, and so on. So if you already have access to those courses on Udemy, go check it out. Let's jump over to my web browser so we can so I can show you some of the stuff that I'm doing here. Okay, first thing up, we've got my website with all of my Docker resources. I show this off every week. You can get the course coupons in case you're not a student of my courses. That's over at brettfisher.com/Docker. I'll actually throw that in chat in case you're not familiar with that. And there's, of course, more courses coming, but there's 2 there. You can actually get subscribed on a newsletter to get notified about my next course, Docker for Node.js, when that launches. And there's lots of resources there, lots of free stuff, videos on this YouTube channel, public videos from conferences that I talk at, like DockerCon, where I do sessions on Swarm and Docker production. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff you can check out there as well. So one of the big news things for this week is I'm launching this podcast, as I said. So this is actually going to be available. The episodes will be available on podcast.brettfisher.com. The first 4 are up now, but I'm still waiting on iTunes and the other podcast directories to start listing it. But I didn't want to wait because you're here in this Q&A, so you get the latest stuff, right? So I'll put this in chat as well. And you can go check that out. So you can play the episodes on the website now. And then as they come available on the directories like Google Play and Spotify and Pandora and all the other places that you can get them, the the buttons will start showing up on this website, and I'll make further announcements in my newsletter. And if you're in my courses, you'll get some educational announcements about that as well. So once this stuff is available for easily download on your smartphones, it'll be up, and I'll probably talk about it more next week. So that's a big deal because I think, we're all in this race to learn as fast as possible. And I myself have been listening to podcasts for forever, since they were called, probably since before they were called podcasts, right? Back when we had Creative Labs made a little thing before Apple, and it was this like little bitty device that you could put MP3s on. And then Apple sort of made up the podcast terminology. But that was a long, long time ago, and I've never done a podcast. Don't know why. I've been on other people's podcasts multiple times, but never actually made my own. So thanks for your ideas, because that's how this got started, was sometime last year. Someone brought up the idea that it would be handy. So we thought about it. I thought about how possibly I could get an hour-long show into an audio-only format that made sense. And so the clips that make sense for audio will go in here. Obviously, if I'm doing a lot of demos and things that won't make sense in audio, they won't make it into the show. But check that out. Let me know what you think. Send me an email there, send me a tweet, whatever. Let me know what you think of that show and how it could be better. All right, so this week, one of the topics I want to share before we get to the Q&A is about Windows Docker Desktop and a new feature or sort of enhancement on how Docker runs on Windows 10. So if you're a Windows user and you're running Windows 10 Pro or Enterprise, you're lucky enough to be able to use Docker Desktop, which is basically the best way to run Docker on Windows. And it's a part of my courses. I talk about it. Obviously, if you have older versions of Windows, you don't get to use Docker Desktop. But once you get to that Windows 10 Pro, one of the things is how to run the Windows containers. And we've talked about for years about Linux containers. And you can run Linux containers on Windows, right? But a couple years ago, Microsoft came up with this new concept of Windows containers, which was Windows binaries launching inside of Windows in a container. And technically, what's happening in the background there is it's a Windows Server kernel. So when you're on Windows 10 today, by default, and you start up a Windows Microsoft SQL Server, for example, when you start that container, it's going to spin up a small little core server or a nano server, which are different types of Windows Server 2016 or 2019 that essentially are very small. And it launches those and then launches your container in there, right? Now that's great because you get that full server experience, right? You get the server kernel, which is a little bit different than the Windows 10 kernel. You get all the IIS features and things that you would get out of a server that are different than what you would get on Windows 10. However, there is, because this is known as Hyper-V isolation, by the way. That's called Hyper-V isolation. And the negative of that is that it takes up more resources, right? You've got to spin up the whole kernel for a new operating system. And ideally, if you're just wanting to run a simple exe, maybe it's it's a .NET exe, maybe it's just a command line exe, it's not actually an IIS website or anything. Or if you just need to run some sort of background process in a container, a Windows container, you don't really need that full VM Hyper-V isolation. So now process isolation has finally come to Windows 10. And what this means is once you turn on a couple of things and enable it, essentially Docker Desktop will let you run a Windows binary on Windows 10 natively without ever having to spin up a Hyper-V container. So this is actually the PR, and I'll in case you're curious on how this all happened. This is the pull request in GitHub. And that's sort of where the action happened with the feature being enabled. And quite frankly, I didn't think this was ever going to happen because out of the gate, the Microsoft team was saying that they didn't really want containers to run natively on Windows 10 because the server kernel was so different that they needed the server kernel in order to have a similar experience no matter where you ran the container. Well, that story has clearly changed now. So we have late in 2018, this feature was added in the latest version of Docker Desktop. But if you could check out Stefan, one of the Docker captains, who's now actually a Docker employee, one of his blog articles talks about how to start this and how to set it up. And there's a few steps that I'm not going to go through live here because, quite frankly, he does a great job of it. You can just read his article and see the post and the example commands. and get it running on your machine. And basically at the end of it, you will have been running Windows executables and Windows containers without ever having to start up a Hyper-V server. We don't yet have the ability to run Docker Desktop, because I know some of you were thinking this. Does that mean now can I run Docker Desktop on Windows 10 Home, which doesn't have Hyper-V? That was a question we all immediately asked in the captain's chat to see whether or not we could get that going. Right now, that's still not possible. Docker Desktop needs this all Hyper-V running in order to install and get that working. But it is possible to do this process isolation, it's hard to say, without Hyper-V. So we're hoping, maybe it's possible somewhere in this year, maybe even, that Docker Desktop could possibly run only for process isolation on Windows containers on Windows 10 Home. Now, this means that in that scenario, if that were ever to work, you still couldn't run Linux containers, you still couldn't run Windows containers in Hyper-V isolation. So there's a lot of limitations here, and it would really prevent you, especially the fact you can't run Linux containers without Hyper-V. This would still really limit you. But it's sort of a little bit of a crack in the limitation around requiring Windows 10 Pro in order to run Docker Desktop. Anyway, we don't know if that's ever going to happen. I mean, these projects are largely open source. Even Docker Desktop, though it's not completely open source, it depends entirely on the engine, which is fully open source. So we really need open source contributions there, or for it to be a real big priority for the Windows team. And having experience with the target market for Docker Desktop and Docker Enterprise, my feeling is that even though this might be possible on Windows 10 Home, that we won't see that anytime soon, if forever, because every company, every enterprise is using Windows 10 Pro or better. Usually enterprise licensing usually means they get Windows 10 Enterprise. So the Windows 10 Home market is probably more of a hobbyist market. And for me as a teacher, I know that my students have Windows 10 Home at home, and then they might have Pro at work, and they probably might be using their home machine, right, to learn Docker. So it's a shame, because even though we're professionals, we would still sometimes use Home at home. But I got this feeling that it's not going to be a top priority with the Windows Docker Desktop team. But we'll see, right? I don't want to get your hopes up. I don't have any insider information or anything. I just know that this stuff is, one, complicated, and it can be hard to get right. And then for stuff like this, it has to be a big priority to happen quickly. So it's not probably something I would have guessed that the big enterprises in the world are all asking for Windows 10 Home compatibility. So, but you never know. So check that out. Try that. Let me know in the comments. Of course, send me out a tweet, or if you're in the Docker Mastery Slack, let me know there if you can get this working, because it's pretty great. And I think it'll save you some resources and make it much faster to spin up and spin down containers if you're working on Windows containers. So that's really all the announcements I had for this week. I wanted to keep it short so we could spend more time on Q&A. So if you have questions, make sure you're getting those container and DevOps questions into chat. They don't have to be Docker related. And my goal is to work my way from the top down and see how many we can answer in an hour. And of course, if you're in chat and you see someone else asking a question, feel free to help them with the question in chat if I don't get to it yet. Since I work from the top down, I may not see your comments or answers at the bottom. But one thing that one of you brought up in the last couple of weeks is that once these YouTube videos go live on YouTube later, right, once they go into the YouTube directory or whatever, they don't have the live chat in them. And that's because I trimmed the beginning and the ending so that we don't have all of that buffering, so that people don't have to skip forward in the video, right? Because there's the 5 minutes of waiting to start stream stuff. So I clip all that, but the problem with YouTube is that means that live chat won't work. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to bring the live chat window. Let's see if we can do this. The live chat window in here. Let's see if we can fit it. And that way, I know I got my little window there. Let's see if I can maybe make that a little bit easier. Yeah, it might be a little bit easier to read. All right, so let's see who's first. All right, Marty, hello. So Marty asks, isn't the Docker network segmented from the host/public network? A coworker seems to think that the IP range in our Docker environment might cause a conflict with our normal company network. So that's actually a great question. The answer to the first one is yes. The Docker, well, so by default, right, you're using Docker network drivers, and the default one is Bridge. If you're using Swarm, the default one is Overlay. And of course, you can use other network drivers. In fact, if you see me jump into here, and I just do a Docker network ls, oh, my Docker's not running. Oh, and look at that. There's a new version of Docker out. No, I do not want to update that today. So let me give me a minute for Docker to start. But there's a list of Docker network drivers that come out of the box. And you choose the default one, Bridge, by just creating a Docker network or not even specifying a network, and it'll use Bridge. Most of us in production will use other networks like Swarm Overlay, or Kubernetes will have its own network drivers. There are other ones like Host and Mac VLAN that you can use as well. You can technically even use none, which will disable networking. But the thing here is that if you're talking about the default Bridge network, which again is probably not what you're going to use in production, that is a network segment. So it's its own subnet range, and it's running in Bridge mode. So that means it's going to NAT itself outside of that private subnet into your company networks. But even though it won't technically conflict with your physical networks, you can't have the same subnets that are used outside your host, and that is due to just standard TCP/IP routing. So if you follow the IP protocol routing details, essentially if I'm on, let's say, a 10.0.0.0 subnet on my Docker container inside of Docker, and then a 10.0.1 subnet is used somewhere in my corporate network, then my container on my local machine won't know how to route to that network because it thinks that that network is actually already a part of my local subnet, right? So you can't technically have any subnet clashing anywhere in the hopping of containers around. So even though it technically NATs, it's still going to probably cause issues. And in fact, with some companies, because the Docker networks out of the box are usually 172 subnets, and sometimes companies overlap those subnets, and that causes a problem, which means that companies have to go into their Docker settings, for instance, going up here into preferences, and they would go into the daemon config, and let's see, I'm not sure, I don't think there's a subnet option yet. Let's see. I thought one day I saw one. Oh, so yeah, so this is the default subnet right here. It's a little hard to see maybe on the screen, but it's a 192.168.65 subnet in mine. And you can change that, but you also may need to change other defaults inside the daemon config over here under advanced, based on whether you're using Swarm Overlay or using the default Bridge and so on and so forth. So yes, this is possible. And basically, if you're not sure, just test, create containers, see if you can get, maybe try to ping something on your network. The first way that usually people tell that this is a problem is they create containers on their machine, and then they maybe have a SQL server or something in their data center or in a server closet that they need to get to. So then they try to get from their container to that machine, and they can't connect. It'll give them some, depending on the application and what you're using, it might give you an error. So try to ping. Try to do a trace route. Add those utilities into a container and see if you can trace route or ping to that remote IP address. Because, of course, if you're not someone who's managing all the subnets in your company, you may not know every subnet used all around the network. Now, another thing is that if you're using cloud, like if you're using AWS subnets, and your company maybe houses part of their infrastructure there, and you have VPNs between you and AWS, then you also have to care about the subnets in AWS and whether those will clash as well. So basically, Docker subnets, even though they're natted, aren't going to help you solve problems for getting packets out any more than any other subnet on your network. Basically, you should not and probably can't use two subnets the same anywhere in your network, right? It may allow you to get packets in because technically the packets coming in know how to get to your machine because you're natted. But when you try to send packets back out, your machine may say, well, hey, I don't need to send these packets out because that particular IP address is in my local subnet, or at least it thinks it is, right? So hope that makes sense. That's just sort of some of the limitations of IP subnetting. And yes, you may have to change that. All right, great question. On to the next one. Let's just scan there and make sure I got the question. Yeah. All right. So Vamsi, sorry if I mispronounced your name. Vamsi asks, could you please point me for setting up Docker Swarm cluster in AWS using Terraform? GitHub links, question mark. Yeah, it looks like someone else might have sent you, develop a bit, sent you a link. So check that out. I don't have yet a personal Terraform example. I do have examples. Let's just see if my Docker's running, by the way. Yep. I do have examples using Terraform, but they're not ones I created or ones you can probably use. If you were in my dog versus cat repo, I have a specific example for setting up the Docker certified infrastructure, which is Terraform plus Ansible, and it's designed to deploy Docker Enterprise. So that's actually not even my example. That's Docker's example that I just pulled in and was using. So I do have some stuff there, but it's definitely not for the simple open source swarm that you might need. That's a good example. I would love for someone to do a pull request on this repo with some Terraform scripts that they've tested in AWS and to help other people, right? So if you're someone who's figured this out and you've got some examples, this is an open source repo. It's supported by myself and the community. So if you have anything, I'd welcome it as a PR there. So hopefully that helps. All right, who's up next? Arshad, hello. The question is, in terms of security, what would be your opinion between using user in the Docker file or Gosu? Well, that's a great question because it was asked last week and it is now inside the podcast. So I talk about that in, let's go look at the episodes under the podcast. Episode 3, look at that. So last week I talked a little bit about using non-root users in containers using sudo, gosu, and dealing with file permissions, especially on bind mounts. So hopefully you can listen to that later. But the short answer there is the user is what you control how your application runs, and you would use gosu in a image when you're building in order to do things as super user. They're not usually, you use them together, right, to get things done. You probably can't use gosu from the actual user you're running, or at least you shouldn't, from the user running your app, because you usually don't want the user running your app to be able to super user, right? You don't want them to be able to get root. That's the whole reason you use the user command in Docker files anyway. So you probably would, if you need gosu, it's probably for some other user that has super user rights, unless you're just going to use the default root user. And then when you use the user statement later, it's probably for more least privileged stuff. So if you have a more specific question on exactly your scenario, and maybe you have a problem that you can't quite figure out how to solve, a lot of times people are asking these questions related to file permissions. So you need to definitely straighten out your file permissions before you change the user in your Docker file. So if you need to, chmod or chown files and directories, you definitely want to do that as root so that you don't get permissions denied, and then change the user to whatever your least privileged user is, right? So hopefully that helps. That's okay. These episodes are every week, and we get a lot of the same questions, so it's totally fine. Go check that out. Hopefully it will help you answer that question. Let's see. Hello, Alexandra. So develop a bit. Hello. Question is, do you have any tips for prototyping on Raspberry Pi with Docker for ease of DevOps on IoT projects? So let's see, IoT projects with Raspberry Pi. So the interesting thing is you can run, so first off, you have to think about architecture, right? The CPU architecture on a Raspberry Pi is not x86 like an Intel, right? It's an ARM64, I believe. So the first thing is if you're using Docker for Mac or Docker for Windows, right? The Docker desktop client, you can run those ARM64 containers on your local machine just to make sure your software works right and your Docker file works right and all that stuff before you send it over to the Raspberry Pi. So that's a huge problem solver, right? So that means you can develop your app locally or mess with your apps locally in ARM64 containers, right? So you're going to need to use ARM64 FROMs in your Docker file, and then whatever stuff you need to add into your image, you're going to be building those. You can build those locally, and you can send them up to a registry, right? And then jump into your Raspberry Pi, however you want to do that, whether it's over USB or you just plug it in directly to some sort of KVM solution, or you SSH into it over the network, however you want to get to it. Then you would have Docker on that machine, all right, on that Pi, and then you would pull down the images and run them to make sure that they run the way you expect on that Raspberry Pi. So I am not a Raspberry Pi expert, but from my friends that are, the sense I get is that you wouldn't necessarily be developing or creating your containers images rather on the Raspberry Pi. You wouldn't necessarily be building it, I mean, even though you could. It's probably easier for you to do that all locally on your Mac or Windows machine. And the way that all works, by the way, is QEMU. Oops. So QEMU is an emulation function feature, basically, that you can download and use QEMU with other things, but it's built into Docker with the desktop edition. So it allows you to run not just ARM, but also other types of architectures and processors, and it will run those inside your Docker Linux VM in the background transparently. And so they'll act like regular x86 containers. And then once you get things, rolling and correct, then you would upload your image to a registry that your Pi would have access to, and then you could pull those images and run them on your Pi, right? I think that's a better workflow than trying to make your Pi sort of your container developer situation, right? You technically don't even need the Pi to build it. So go check that out. And if you need more resources on that, there's a couple of really great people in the ARM community. Alex Ellis has a blog, so that's alexellis.io. And I'll throw that URL in chat. Yeah. Just in case you weren't aware. He does some pretty interesting examples of Pis, sort of how to use Docker with Pi and all that. He actually builds little Raspberry Pi clusters for Swarm and all that. So check out his blog articles for more information. He's a much better resource than I am. All right. Paulo, hello. Great info as always. After watching your videos for approximately 3 years and learning Docker over the years, I am now working for Docker. What? Well, congratulations. You are now, I think, the third or fourth person that has told me they got a job at Docker and that in the past they were learning Docker through my courses. So I'm very excited that I could in any way help you on your career, and congratulations. Of course, I've never worked at Docker, but here it's a great place to work. So bravo to you, and hopefully I'll see you at DockerCon. Started last week and have the opportunity to meet Stefan, yeah, and hope to meet you at DockerCon in San Francisco. Well, great. Make sure that you ping me in the Docker community Slack or where on Twitter or something when we're there, and we'll definitely hang out. Maybe I'll have you on the show. Maybe we can do a little live YouTube. But congratulations again. That's great news. Let's see, Peloton, I think. Hello. Running into issues with using HTTPS curl. I have a web and an API container. If I do curl container from one container, I get a good response. If I do an HTTPS container, I get an error saying curl unknown protocol. If I HTTP to other outside sites, it works. oh, I can HTTPS curl into the API container from outside the web container. Okay. Well, the first thing is, I just want to let you know that you don't necessarily have to HTTPS every individual container, because that can be a little bit tricky, right? Especially considering that the containers are a different URL from the internet than they are from each other. So that could cause you to have challenges with hostname resolution in the HTTPS certificate. So you can certainly do SSL to improve security overall inside the container networks. I don't see a lot of people doing that, even though it's not really a bad thing, right? It is better security overall. But for people that need encryption on a network, like let's say you're using overlay or bridge networks, you can, like with an overlay network, you can enable not TLS encryption, but IPsec encryption on the entire network so that your containers are at least communicating to each other securely, if that's the reason that you're implementing SSL inside your container networks. If you're thinking about from the internet getting to your containers, typically the easier solution there is to put a front-end proxy in front of those containers that manages, proper URL redirection, right? Because if you're going to have multiple containers on SSL, they're all going to want to use the same port on the internet. So you're going to need some sort of proxy to translate the DNS into which container needs the traffic. And then usually that proxy can also manage all your certificates for the proper URLs and whatnot. And if you're familiar with Let's Encrypt, which gets you auto certificates for free and allows you to have publicly trusted certificates, if you've ever heard of Traffic, Traffic is one that I advocate for. There's obviously other ones. There's Docker Proxy, which is a good one as well. But one of the things that Traffic does out of the box is it works with Let's Encrypt to automatically grab you certificates just for the front-end proxy in front of your containers. So that way, on the back end, your containers don't need SSL inside the container itself. You can actually just run pure HTTP amongst each other because they're on that limited Docker network that is only accessible by other containers in that network, right? And then your proxy on the front end sits in front of those. It listens to Swarm and updates itself based on Swarm, and then it takes incoming traffic and turns it into whatever container it needs to go to, right? So if you looked at my dog versus cat repo, which I mentioned earlier, over here, dog versus cat, I have examples of how that works. So there's actually a stack proxy global. There's two stacks in there. One that's just called proxy, one is proxy global. And it shows how to use traffic as a fault-tolerant, highly available, load-balanced front-end reverse proxy for Swarm, and have many different websites all running in containers in the back end. And that way your SSL stays up with the proxy and then you don't need it in the back. Now, that being said, if you still need SSL running inside your containers on the network, so you're actually using traffic. Okay, so you're saying that. You're already using traffic. So the question really is, are you using traffic for the SSL, or are you actually putting certificates inside your containers and having them start as containers? It sounds like you're doing the latter and that you're having problems. As to what the error is in curl when you get a bad response, I don't know what's curl error 35 off the top of my head is without Googling, so I obviously would have to refer to Google for that exact error in curl. If someone were to tell me that curl is getting an error, the first couple of things I would think is, one, the certificate is invalid for the wrong name, and that maybe is the error that curl is getting. And in other words, you're trying to go to HTTPS container, and the DNS name in there is not that, right? Maybe it's an IP address, maybe it's something else. So, or it's possible that curl doesn't have the SSL libraries, the open SSL. So that can be sometimes an issue in containers where you don't have the trusted certificates, the root certificates, or all the proper libraries for proper encryption. That is usually not an issue if you install curl through like apt-get or yum or something, because then all the dependencies for curl will be installed. But I do know that some containers out of the box don't come with all the proper SSL libraries. However, you are saying that curl works when you go to the internet with it. So that tells me that it's got something, right? It's got some SSL libraries because it's at least able to decrypt. Out of the box, by the way, curl does not have the capability to decrypt SSL. That's the job of something like OpenSSL libraries that do that decryption and encryption for you. And curl just uses those. So I don't have any immediate recommendations on the curl other than maybe try something like HTTP ping instead of curl. If you've got some sort of weird bug with curl or a problem with curl, you can check out my let's see, on hub, I have the image for HTTP ping, and HTTP ping is similar to, it's like ping for curl, essentially. And yeah, luckily it looks like mine is the most popular. All right, right at the top there. So I didn't make this tool. I basically just packaged it up, provided as an image, so you can use it for testing. And so go check that out if you need to do SSL testing. I know that mine works so that you can actually try that out. So there's a couple of tips. Hopefully that works for you. Good luck. All right, so we're back to the user and Gosu questions. And you're saying I asked was because I had seen some comments that user will cause issues for others who inherit from your container and Gosu in Docker entry point instead. Well, yeah. So if someone's inheriting from your container, that just means that whatever they're doing in their Docker file may be running as that user, and so they would just need to change user back to root, right? So totally fixable, just not, when I'm creating a Docker file from your Docker file, that is a problem. By the way, like a good example of that is to go look at the default node image, and because I'm working on my node course, I know that this is an issue. So like with Node, for a lot of other apps, you want them to run as least privilege, right? So in the, let's go down here to like the latest version, 10.15 here. And you'll notice in this file, right, that you'll see that it does the group add and user add to create the node user, and then it hard codes it to user 1000. That's for easier later management of the user IDs. And if you want more information on the user IDs and how those relate in containers, jump over to my podcast, which I feel like I'm going to be saying a lot of. Jump over to the podcast and check out that non-root users episode 3, because I talk a little bit about that and some tips in there. But anyway, so in this official node image, you will notice there is no user, and it doesn't take the node app and turn it into the least privileged user. So this node right here is technically still running as root. And that is because they expect you, and this is probably part of your problem, or part of the awareness that you have, is that if I created my own app from Node and then I did some installations of apt-get, then I would have problems, right? So it's up to me, the downstream user, to add the user node inside my own Docker file. So that, but at least they create the user for me, right? And I don't know if that's in the documentation. Let's see if that is in their documentation for this official image. No, they don't say anything in there. They should. That should be an update in there to just say, hey, by the way, just take user node at the very end of your own Docker file to use least privilege running of the node app. So interesting point. So thanks for that comment. Justin Kramer, hello. Long shot here, as it is a bit off topic, but I am running 2 Elasticsearch containers for a dev environment. Yesterday, with no changes, status went from green to yellow. Any thoughts as where to start looking? Yes. So if you didn't change anything, so there are URLs in, well, first thing, right, look at the container logs. The status in Elasticsearch is an endpoint URL that you can go check. So if you look up, and I'm not sure how much you know about Elasticsearch. So for everyone's edification, Elasticsearch, a database for searching, for storing search data and retrieving search data, and its interface is an HTTP interface. Let's see, Elasticsearch health URL. So there are URLs for the cluster, and you can ping or get to certain URLs to get data about the status, and there's multiple URLs. So it's not really a great troubleshooting mechanism, but it might shed a little bit of light on pulling from different URLs, and there's more than just cluster health. There's other health stuff under the APIs. And what I will know off the top of my head is that if you have one Elasticsearch node, or if you have multiple Elasticsearch nodes that don't have every shard replicated, then that's when it goes yellow, because one of the ways that a cluster will turn yellow is when you don't have data replicated in some way for high availability. So one of the challenges I have is when I'm testing, sometimes I'll just be testing with a single Elasticsearch container, and that container will always be status yellow as far as I remember, because none of the data on there is replicated to a different Elasticsearch node, right? So I don't really care about that because I'm developing. But one of the challenges with that is if you enable health checks inside your Docker images and in your containers, then the health check will technically fail and could cause problems for you during development. So I have to turn those off when I'm doing development inside of Docker Compose. I can actually just go in and disable the health check in my Compose file. That way, if it's ever yellow, which it usually is for me, it won't be an issue. The other potential raise right away that I think the cluster health would be yellow. I don't think space would be an issue for you. I'm really thinking it's probably replicated data, that you have some sort of shard of data that either doesn't have a replica on the other instance or is not syncing properly or something. And I would think that your logs, your Elasticsearch logs, would help you clue in on that. So off the top of my head, hopefully that helps. I don't know if I'm right or not, but good luck. And Biker's back. Oh, FYI, this is some breaking news here. We finally got Docker to acknowledge a problem with UCP installed in Azure. If anyone is having a problem with installing version 3.1 or greater, use an older version until it's fixed. Great news. That is probably, I wonder if did they put something, Biker, if you're still on, did they put that into the Success KB article, hopefully? So at least people can find that on the Success site. So if you're a Docker Enterprise user, you know that basically the KB article website for Docker is the Success portal. And you can often find bugs there like UCP Azure. Or not necessarily bugs, but workarounds and fixes. And I don't know if your bug is storage. Is your bug storage related on Azure? It's interesting. Anyway, yeah, if you have more info, feel free to put it in chat, or if you have a link for anything, that'd be great. But thanks for that update. All right, next question. Back to Pellin. Use an existing Laravel project. I'm stuck with SSL connections. Oh, okay. Yeah, so SSL connections across containers. So the container should not be going through the proxy to get to the other container, right? So if you got multiple Laravel containers on a Docker network, they should just be talking directly to each other over HTTP. And unless you have some high-end security requirement that IPsec and front-end SSL proxies don't solve for you, I would not do SSL in containers, especially until I was like a super pro in distributed computing. Because really, this is sort of a distributed computing problem. But that network's already isolated. It's already protected from other traffic. It's already prevented from getting internet traffic. So I'm not terribly motivated. Of course, I'm not doing banking, right? But I'm not terribly motivated to put SSL in each container because that's a lot more work. So see if that helps you. I don't know if you have some sort of specific requirement that none of those other problems actually solve. But yeah, the way that it's expected is that out of the gate, you're just using the short URL and using HTTP, and then the proxies in the front end use the SSL and translate to the back. So that way your Laravels don't have to worry about each other and trust each other's certificates, right? Because the minute you have SSL connections to an untrusted certificate, because maybe they're auto-generated, you now have to have the incoming client, whether that's a different PHP app or something, it has to then deal with untrusted connect. It has to basically allow self-signed certs, right? And you can have multiple problems. It can be a self-signed, which is a problem. It can have a different name than what is on the certificate, which is a different problem, right? It can be expired because your container has been running too long, right? There's all sorts of potential problems there that can break an app. So hopefully that helps. So Redo, hopefully pronounced your name close. Hello, Brett. If you have a service which is created but not started yet, waiting for mount to appear, as soon as the mount point is there, the service starts. But if while in create state, Docker system prune is called, the service will not start because the resources are deleted from Docker system prune. Would you rate this as working as designed or as a bug? I would say that's a bug, and I would file that in the Moby. I would file that as Moby. Because regardless of what driver you're using, whether you're using Rexray or the local default driver, basically it sounds like what it is. It's technically an oversight, right? The service hasn't created the task, or the task has been created, but the task hasn't been able to create a container because it's dependent upon a volume resource that doesn't exist, right? So that means that the prune command, and this is going to be part of the problem, okay? The prune command is not swarm aware. So the prune command cannot look at the task or the service in order to figure out if there's potential for it to be used, right? For that image to be used. So I could see this being a case where there needs to be a prune command specifically for swarm, right? And it's interesting that you state this, because I have not, with any of my clients or users, I have not experienced this, but I can see exactly how this would happen, right? Because what happens is when you create a task, the task can't create the container, right? Because technically when you create a container, we all use Docker Run. Docker Run does two things for you. It does a create, and then it does a start. In order to create a container definition, it has to type out this Docker create line, which most of us don't use that, but that command does exist. And that command needs the volume when it's created. It's essentially creating the metadata before it launches the container. And so when you do a task, the task is waiting on the volume, from the driver, I guess, in your case, to be created so that it can create the container metadata. And in your case, yeah, so it must be doing it out of order, right? It's downloading the image as part of preparing. And then when that preparing is finished, then it tries to create the container, but it's still waiting on the volume. So the way to kind of fix that, at least on Docker's end, is that in the task ordering of actions, it should create the volume first before it downloads the image, right? Or at least start the process of the volume and then wait for the volume. That way, the image is the last thing downloaded. So hopefully you don't prune out the image. What I would say on that is your way to solve this, I mean, obviously there's a bug. I would recommend you definitely file a bug. You can even at Brett Fisher me, and I can give more clarity in there if you want. If you just want to at me in your issue description at Brett Fisher, I can help out if needed, right? Because it is an open source community project, and you would do this on Docker/Docker, not in the Swarm kit, but do it on Moby/Moby. So all the issues related to Swarm, even though they might be done in Swarm kit, you would still Moby. And so, yeah, so you could go in here to the issues, create a new one, follow their guide, right, on what to do for creating a new issue. And then they'll probably say, hey, can you open up a Swarm kit issue as well? Because this is definitely this might be a Swarm kit bug. This might be considered a prune bug, right? And we want to track it in both places. But Moby is always where you start. And I would say for you, if you're going to write a script, which is what I do, I don't actually have a script, but I have a inline script example. So what I do over here in Swarm, under stack prune, I do a little while true right here, right? So I'm doing an inline bash loop that does while true basically forever, do Docker image prune. So what I would do personally is I would turn this into a script that would not run that image prune command on a specific node if there was any, if there was any tasks that weren't, I'm already seeing a fallacy, a problem with my idea, but I would basically have it look and see if there's any tasks that are not created or any services that are not matching, right? They're in sort of a preparing state of some sort. And you might even have to use a script that would pull from do a curl on an API or something. So it might get a little tricky. You also then now have to do this against the Swarm API, which requires permissions. So you couldn't always do this on every worker node. But essentially, the workaround here is somehow to get you to make sure that there is nothing waiting on volumes before it prunes images, right? Or on your images, do an image prune here, and somehow we need to figure out, I don't know if this is possible, we would figure out how to do a prune only on old images, right? So images that are maybe been downloaded for a while. And maybe that would help. Not sure. But there's interesting workarounds there. I would definitely be interested in following that bug. So as soon as you post it, ping me in Twitter, or if you just ping me in the GitHub issue, I'll get an email, and I would definitely love to follow that because, yeah, that sounds like a bug. So great question. All right, what's next? Yeah. Yeah, the mount is mounted as a volume in the container. Got it. Yeah, okay, Justin, yeah, the cluster health helped me. Looks like only the primary node is storing shards. Great. It's always great when we can, in the same hour of the episode, we can find a problem and find a solution. So good job, Justin. You get an internet high five for that. All right, so it looks like we're about with the end of the hour. If you have any last minute questions, get those in now. I'll give you a minute or two to throw any more questions in for sort of the last question of the hour. And while we're waiting on that, I will again mention that my resources are available over at brettfisher.com/docker. And do check out the new podcast. Feel free to wait until I get everything, and then I'll send out, if you're on my newsletter, you'll get an announcement in the newsletter once iTunes and Google Play and Spotify and Pandora and like the other dozen places all have the podcast listed. And then expect any of the good answers that we have out of the show that I'll turn into podcast audio only little clips and add them as new episodes every week. So hopefully, if we can get ourselves organized, my team and I will figure out a way to make sure that we're getting regular updates to this. And so, when you're on your commute or if you're in an airplane or whatever, and you happen to miss these episodes, you can maybe check out stuff specific that you're interested in. So let's see if anyone else has got a last minute question. Justin gave me the high five back. So it looks like we're all out of questions for today. That's great. We filled the hour. And of course, this will always be available later on today once it gets back up on YouTube and processed there's actually a playlist down below. If you click on my name at the bottom of this video, you can get into the playlist that has all the past episodes for this. I think we're on episode, 20 or 30 something at this point. So we're racking up there. And I will see you next week on YouTube. Thanks for joining.